Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. It's an exciting time to be an aspiring or emerging writer in the current Australian literary landscape. New authors are being discovered and published every day. More and more, we are seeing the rise in popularity of homegrown fiction titles and the willingness of Australian publishers to give a platform for our unique stories. My next guest is a shining example for aspiring writers. She wrote no less than 10 full manuscripts before her first novel, The Tea Chest, was published. She's published internationally in New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, Norway and Germany, and her new novel, The Gift of Life, has just hit the shelves here in Australia. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Josephine Moon to the podcast today. Hi, Jo.
Hi, thanks so much for having me along.
It's my pleasure. Jo, I had the greatest pleasure of meeting you recently for one of the launch events for your new novel, The Gift of Life. And I have to say, I was fascinated to hear you speak about the inspiration behind this novel and of your desire to demystify the organ donation process in Australia at least. It's a thought-provoking premise and one I'm sure many listeners are going to want to hear more about.
So The Gift of Life is a story about two women who are connected by the one heart. So we have Gabby McPhee, who had a heart transplant 2 years prior to the book opening, and she owns a very cute little boutique cafe and coffee roasting house in Melbourne. And into her cafe one day walks Crystal Arthur, who donated her husband's organs 2 years prior to the book opening, and who is convinced that Gabby has her husband's heart. And the moment they meet, it sets off a chain of reactions or a chain of events that bring them together to work together to solve a mystery. And that mystery surrounds the cause of Crystal's husband's death, because he was in another city the night he died. As far as she was concerned, he walked out the door of Melbourne, went to work in a restaurant and never came home. And the police called her later on that night and said, your husband's in Sydney and he's had a terrible accident, he's in ICU, you need to come straight away. So she's never known why he was in another city, and so that's a great stumbling block for her moving through grief. And Gabby, as I think most organ recipients do, struggles with the guilt, the fact that she's alive because someone else is dead. So the two of them, help each other move through this sort of these blocks that they find in their life in this processing of grief, essentially.
And as you explained in the acknowledgements, the first spark of inspiration for this story came from an episode of the Phil Donahue show some years ago. Can you elaborate on that?
It did. So about 20 odd years ago, I was watching an episode of Phil Donahue, not really sure what I was doing, whether I was home from uni or I don't know, just don't remember. But anyway, I saw this episode and this woman came on the show and she had had a heart transplant and she had a very, very unique connection to her donor, which she was able to verify many years later when she tracked down his family. And one of the examples she gave, which was the one that really struck me the most, was not long after waking up from surgery, she had this intense craving for beer and chicken nuggets, which were just things that she didn't eat. She was a professional dancer. Her diet was really, really clean. It was just not something on her radar. So it was a very bizarre thing to be craving. And she wrote a memoir about this, which I read while I was researching the book. And she had a long list of incredible things that happened that connected her to her donor. But one thing, when she tracked down his family, they could tell her that he'd been a young man riding a motorcycle and had a motorcycle accident. And he had just been through the drive-through of a fast food restaurant and he had a packet of chicken nuggets stuffed down his leather jacket when he died. And that struck me so strongly. And it was just such an amazing connection that it sort of, always stayed with me. And they call it cellular memory, this theory that we store memories all over our body, not just in our brain. And so organs have the potential to carry across memories with them to a recipient. So, 20-odd years later, then I saw an episode of Pulse, which was an ABC medical drama. And the first episode, there was a young woman who got a virus, just like a cold virus or a flu virus, and it went to her heart and gave her heart failure and she needed a heart transplant. And as soon as I saw that, I remembered that episode of Phil Donahue and I just I just had this really strong, like that right there. I really want to explore that and write about that. So that's where it started.
It's fascinating, and I remember when you were talking about this at one of your launch events recently. I actually teared up because I just felt like it was. I mean, it was one. It's one of those goose flesh raising moments to hear something like that happen. You can never really believe that something like that would be possible, but to hear it talked about anecdotally in that fashion, it really does raise lots of questions.
Indeed, and it's, the more research, I did a lot of research on this, and there is so much anecdotal evidence or testimony, just personal testimony from people, describing these types of things. And even when I was researching, I was really lucky to interview two heart transplant recipients, and they were both really different people. And there was two things. So one, this middle-aged man that I was interviewing, he'd been in the very, very rare position of having donated his son's organs many years prior to then needing an organ, transplant himself. He needed a heart transplant. And that really, really struck me as that full circle nature of organ donation, and that there are very much two halves to the one story of organ donation. And any of us can be on either side of that story at any time, which is why I ended up writing the book from both Gabby and Crystal's points of view. So just like a heart has two halves, there are two halves to this story. But my other transplant recipient that I interviewed, she was much younger, in her 20s, and we had a very long chat. It was a great chat. She was very open about sharing her experiences, and she started telling me about all these weird and wonderful things that had happened to her post transplant. And the one that struck me so strongly was that she had a little manual car that she loved. Her car was her baby. It was a really important thing to her. And not long after surgery, she just went, I need to sell that car. I don't want that car anymore. I want a different car. I want an automatic car. I now only ever want to drive automatic cars. It was just such a weird and sudden change. And it was a whole list of things that she said. And I said to her, have you heard of cellular memory? And she said no, she hadn't. Asked me what it was. I explained what I knew. And she said, well, that makes perfect sense to me, because I say there's two of us in here and I'm living for two people. And so that really gave me the confidence to pursue that storyline as well.
Absolutely. Now, organ donation is a difficult topic of discussion for many Australians, isn't it?
I think, it's just such an emotional thing, because to talk about it, you have to talk about death. And basically, we're not very good at talking about death in our culture. We're so far removed from that end of life. There's a beautiful book by Brooke Davis called Lost and Found, which is all about grief. And her character, Millie, says right at the beginning, we know everything there is about life. We know everything there is about how it starts, everything, almost nothing about death. Like, we're just not taught anything about death. So, to talk about organ donation, we have to talk about death. And that's really confronting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think philosophically, we're all in support of the idea. And this is something that you touched on in one of your talks, but the consent process surrounding organ donation is fraught with difficulty here in Australia. And this is something you've highlighted so well in the book, and something I'm sure many Australians would be unaware of.
Well, we're all encouraged, the sort of campaigns around it are encouraging us to talk with our families about making sure we know what our wishes are, which is really, really important. That became extremely clear to me writing the book as well, that, my husband and I had both sort of gone, oh yeah, organs, how do you think about that? Yep, all good. Yep. But that's not really a conversation. And it really made me go back and go, you know what, we need to actually sit down and talk this through properly from beginning to end, so that we're really, really clear about this. Because the character of Crystal in this book, when her husband dies, she's in that position where she's in so much shock, so much grief. She's been ripped out of a different city with two tiny children. She has no family support. She's never talked about this with her husband. She has no idea what his wishes were. The family is at odds. So his family is at odds with her over what to do. And it's just an excruciating and awful position for her to be in. And she does consent to the donation, but she hasn't done it in a way that brings her any kind of peace. So she has to work through an awful lot of doubts and grief and regrets and guilt and all sorts of things about that, which, it just really highlighted that the time to talk about organ donation is not when you're standing in ICU with your loved one on life support. It's a lot earlier than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope as a result of this podcast that people do start to think a little bit about talking to their loved ones about their wishes in this awful event. But I also wanted to say that last week when you were chatting, we were fortunate to hear from a lady in the audience who had to go through this process recently with the death of her sister. And I was struck by the unfairness and, dare I say, the callousness of the current system, which puts a great deal of stress on already vulnerable and grieving loved ones. And as you've just mentioned, you were able to capture that, the essence of that dilemma so beautifully and in such a heartfelt way in the book. I wondered, did you actually have any first-hand accounts of that before writing these scenes?
No, I didn't. And it was one of the things that also really prompted me to write from Crystal's perspective, because when I was doing early research, I never totally know where my books are going when I'm doing research. It's really during research that I sort of find my story and what I'm trying to say. And what I found was that there were so many testimonies from, out there, like in the World Wide Web or wherever, newspapers, media, from people who had received organs, who were obviously ecstatic, delighted, so grateful, so happy, really want to spread the word about how important this is, because, their whole life's been transformed. And I didn't get to include much of it, but the sort of the lead up and waiting period for these guys before they get their organs is just horrendous. It's just, it takes such a toll on them, their whole family. It's financially crippling. It's just awful. And so they're ecstatic, of course, when they get a whole new lease on life and they want to talk about it. But there was an awful lot of silence really from the other side. I really struggled to find very many people who were talking about the fact that they had donated their loved ones' organs. And that place of sort of silence is, as a storyteller, I find that really interesting. That makes me ask a lot of questions and go, well, I want to be able to sort of somehow answer some of those questions in narrative form.
Yeah, and I guess, that was something I wanted to touch on as well. That often silent stories of the donor families. And in that regard, I thought Crystal's story was so raw and so poignant. As you mentioned, she had unanswered questions surrounding her husband's death and she needed closure. But more than that, and as you've said, she felt guilt for agreeing to donate his organ. Is that something that you came across in the research?
Well, no, not really, because as I said, there's just so much silence. I really didn't find... I found very little from Australia. Most of what I found came from America, which is quite tricky in itself because their sort of legal and medical systems are so completely different to ours. But from Australia, no, I just didn't find that much out there. So, but because, it's not hard, I don't think, to put yourself in the position of someone, who's having to make that call, who has no idea what the person wanted. And if you've got a family situation where you've got multiple viewpoints, lots of arguments, lots of pressure, all that sort of difficult family dynamic, particularly if it's not a very well functioning family dynamic, it's not very hard to imagine just how terrible that situation could be if you didn't have that prior information.
Now, I love the inner conflict of your main character, Gabby McPhee. I think, and we've talked about this a little bit before. On the one hand, she's grateful to have been given a second chance at life with her new heart, but she also feels guilty to have had that chance because someone else died. And obviously, that's the more common experience and more common anecdotal evidence that you would have found in your research.
Yeah, certainly both my people that I spoke to expressed that, and I certainly read quite a bit of that as well. Yeah,
and you were talking the other day about the fact that donor recipients are encouraged to contact the donor families with, expressions of thanks. And in this book, Gabby does that, but it takes her a really long time to do that. Why do you think that is?
Partly it's because some of them spend, like the young woman that I spoke to, she'd spent 3 or 4 months in hospital in, having multiple open heart surgeries, her kidneys are shut down, like really, really awful time. So there can be a very, very long, just physical process for them to get through there before they can even, come to the terms with, being in in this life, this new body again. Like my Melissa, the young woman I spoke to, was saying that almost everybody loses their ability to write, like your hand shakes terribly for a really long time. So it can be really difficult to pick up a pen or to pick up a cup or to pick up, like you kind of have to learn to do everything all over again. It's like being a baby. They kind of have to learn to walk again. They have to learn, like all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think there's very, very long physical, kind of rehab process to start with. And then, some of them it's just emotionally just so challenging. They're dealing with their own grief as well. They've lost their own heart, which is massive, right? Your heart is, as culturally we speak, your heart's kind of everything. You live from the heart, you lead by the heart. We know a heart is a lot more than just an organ. So, they're sort of going through this grief process of losing their own heart as well. And then they've got, they may have all these feelings of guilt that, they want to say thank you to this family, but, obviously they had to lose someone for that to happen. So,
yeah,
it's just very difficult.
It is indeed. One of my favourite characters of this book is Sally the service dog. And I know that you're an animal lover in general, but you've managed to convey that special bond that can exist between humans and our four-legged friends and the incredible role they can play as therapy and indeed carers. Is this something you deliberately wanted to address?
All of my books, sorry. So yes, I'm a massive animal person. I live on acreage. I've got way too many animals and I'm never happier than when, I'm with an animal, basically. But so there's always an animal of some sort in my books. I think except for the very first one, the tea chest, I did have a cat in there originally, but then I had to send people overseas and I had nowhere for the cat to go, so I took the cat out. I guess what I write is multi-generational books. So my characters are always covering multiple age groups, probably except for this one, which, both women, one's in their 40s, one's in her early 30s. I like to include animals as well because they're life. They're part of the fabric of life for most of us in one way or another. And, that I live with such big personalitied animals that they're just, they're too good material really to let go to waste. They're just so easy to write into stories. Yeah. So, yeah, it just makes me happy. It's just it's probably part of my voice, really.
I think you'll have lots of people falling in love with a golden retriever.
Yes, well, she was based on my dog Daisy, golden retriever, who died just as I was getting to the end of writing that book. So, which was really, really sad, but it was lucky I got to dedicate the book to her. There's a little baby that Sally guards quite a bit, and Daisy used to do that with my son when he was a baby too. Exactly the same. Sally's way cleaner and better smelling than Daisy ever was. Much better behaved too.
So I wanted to chat briefly about the food themes that run through your books. What do you think is the importance of food in your novels?
So I love writing about food because food connects everyone. Everyone's got food stories. Everyone's memories are attached to food. Everyone's got emotions around food. It's such a part of life, and it can become so much, that food becomes a character in my book in itself. It really sets sort of the backdrops, the scenes. Often it drives the plot. I like writing about women who have businesses, so that suits my food themes quite well because they can always have food-related businesses. And it wasn't really intentional to begin with. When I wrote the tea chest, I had been really searching for a creative career. I'd been writing for a long time, but more than that, I mean, I never really thought I'd get published. So more than that, I was just looking for a creative career. And it struck me one day that I love tea, and it struck me one day that somebody got paid to design tea blends. And I just thought, oh my God, that's like the greatest job ever. So I couldn't actually do that myself. So I thought I would write about somebody who was doing that. And then I had so much fun doing that. And I got to the next one and got a 2-book deal and hadn't written a second book. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just keep doing that. So I'll write about chocolate because why wouldn't you? Think about the research, right? I had to eat so much chocolate as research.
Poor you.
I imported chocolate, tax-deductible chocolate as research. I mean, it was brilliant. So, yeah, it's fun, basically.
Indeed. I mean, Lara's culinary experiences in Italy for the 3 gold coins were positively drool-worthy. But then in The Gift of Life, Gabby's coffee roasting business brings an altogether different element to the book. So can you tell me a little bit about this coffee roasting phenomenon?
Coffee's having a real moment in Australia right now. It's really, well, I live up in Noosa and there's a big coffee scene up here as well. I would boldly say that it's rivaling Melbourne, actually.
Wow.
There's a lot of roasters up here in Noosa, and I did some great research with Padre, which is one of the coffee houses up here who roast. And Marinus, who owns that business, came from Melbourne originally, but he was just so generous. He, let me come in and, watch everything. Taught me everything about how to roast, and we had a cup and all the different beans. And I got to ask all about the trading processes. And, they just said, film anything you like, photograph anything you'd like. We're so open. They're just so passionate about educating people about coffee. So coffee is, a lot of people understand wine as being, wine is different. A Shiraz is different to a Cabernet, which is different to a Merlot, which is different to a Pinot, But it's still, although it's really grown, it's really exploded in Australia, this understanding that, Ethiopian beans are different to Colombian beans, and, the way you roast it makes it change, and the climate that it came from, what altitude it came from, makes the taste change. There's been a lot of explosion in that sort of knowledge, but still a long way to go. So it's on a big upward trajectory at the moment. It's good fun. I subscribed to Bean Scene, which is like an industry magazine, and it arrives and I read through it, and it's just so fascinating. It's just fascinating. People building these amazing careers on all the different aspects of coffee in the country.
Jo, I know that you have a non-fiction title coming out this year, but I also wanted to know, were you working on any other fiction titles?
Right now I'm working on the second draft of my book for 2020, which is set in the Cotswolds. Doesn't have a title yet, so I'm always quite slow on the title, so I never totally know what I'm writing until I've fully written a first draft. So the first draft for me is quite an exploratory kind of draft. It's all very organic and just sort of I turn up and see what else turns up to meet me. So at the end of the first draft, I look at it and go, okay, well now what does it look like that I wrote, and what is its highest purpose? So I go back and edit it and wrangle it to make it fit into its highest purpose. So that's kind of it is what I'm working on at the moment. I'm on deadline for that one as well at the moment. And I'm loosely plotting my 2021 book in my head. Well, not plotting, just imagining, just letting it, float around and see if it sticks, because they don't always stick. I have lots of ideas that float around, but if they hang around long enough, then I know they're worth pursuing for a bit further.
Jo, if listeners wanted to find out a little bit more about you and your books, where can they find you?
I have a website called josephinemoon.com. So that's got all of my books on it, all info about it. And I am on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. I am on Twitter, but I'm not a very good Twitter person, so I wouldn't hold high hopes of getting much entertainment out of me on Twitter. But yeah, I'm pretty easy to find, and I do love chatting to people.
That's awesome. Jo, I wanted to congratulate you once more on The Gift of Life, a truly beautiful book that should be on everyone's upcoming holiday reading pile. I wish you every success with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books, and for a chance to get your hands on a copy of this wonderful novel, listeners, head over to my Instagram account and follow the directions to enter the draw to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudineteinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.